It was supposed to be a simple hike, just a couple of miles on a familiar trail, an afternoon of peace, and some quiet time alone in the woods. But things went wrong, as they often do when you least expect it. I remember the morning clearly, the sun barely breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, with the scent of pine and earth. I was wearing my favorite boots, the ones that had seen a lot of trails, and I had packed light, a bottle of water, some snacks, a map, and a small first aid kit. The kind of essentials you don't think you'll need, but always bring just in case. I knew the trail well. It was one I'd hiked several times before, a path that wound through thick woods and led to a small, quiet lake. It wasn't supposed to be hard to follow, but something about that day felt different. First, the hike went smoothly. The sounds of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots made the whole experience peaceful. I was focused on putting one foot in front of the other, keeping my mind clear. The kind of hike where you just let your thoughts wander and don't pay much attention to anything around you, trusting the trail to take you where you need to go. But somewhere along the way, I must have lost track of the path. I didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was the way the light shifted in the trees, or maybe it was the quiet, the absence of usual forest sounds like distant animals or the wind in the leaves. It was still, unnervingly still. I stopped and looked around, trying to remember the last clear landmark. I knew I hadn't wandered too far off the trail, but the woods here were dense, and the underbrush thick. The path had become less obvious, the ground beneath my feet more uneven. A glance at my watch told me it had been over an hour since I'd last checked the time. I should have reached the lake by now. I pulled out the map, my fingers trembling a bit as I unfolded it. It was supposed to be simple, straightforward. But the more I looked at the map, the more confused I became. The trail seemed to have disappeared, and the landmarks weren't matching up with what I was seeing in front of me. That's when the panic started to creep in, just a little at first. It's strange how it can happen without you even noticing. The shift from calm to uncertainty. You start second-guessing every step, every turn you made. I decided to keep going, hoping I'd find something familiar. My pace quickened as I pushed deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, and the shadows seemed to stretch further. It felt like the woods were closing in on me, trapping me in their quiet maze. I had no idea how long I'd been walking, but it felt like hours. The sky overhead had started to dim, the sunlight weakening as if it too had given up on trying to pierce the thick canopy. By then, my mind was racing. I thought of my phone, but I couldn't find it. I checked my pockets, my backpack. Nothing. My heart started to race. That was when I realized I had no way of contacting anyone. The thought of being completely alone in the woods with no way out was enough to make the panic swell inside me. But there was no turning back now. I had to keep going. I had to find a way out. Hours turned into what felt like days. I walked in circles, retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees, the underbrush, the uneven terrain. My legs were starting to ache, my stomach growling with hunger. I had a granola bar in my pack, but I couldn't bring myself to eat. I felt nauseous, disoriented, as though the forest itself was somehow messing with my sense of time and space. I started to shout, not for help, there was no one around, but because I needed to hear my own voice. It felt like I was slipping into a quiet, suffocating kind of madness, and I needed something, anything, to break the silence. But the only response was the sound of my own voice echoing back at me, swallowed by the vast, empty woods. Nightfall came fast. The sky darkened to a deep, bruised purple, and I could hear the distant calls of animals, though nothing near enough to make me feel safer. The forest, once so serene, now felt like a maze designed to trap me. I could see nothing beyond the small circle of light from my flashlight, which flickered and dimmed with every step I took. I had to conserve the battery, but it was hard to ignore how much darker it got with each passing hour. I found a small clearing and decided to make camp. It wasn't much, a few dry logs and some leaves to sit on, but I had to rest. My body was exhausted, and my mind was spinning. I huddled under my jacket and tried to calm myself. I told myself I would figure this out. I just needed to get some sleep and wait for morning. Sleep didn't come easily, though. The cold of the night crept into my bones, and every sound in the forest seemed to amplify. Branches cracking in the distance, the scurrying of small animals, the rustle of leaves. My thoughts kept circling back to the same idea. I was lost, completely and utterly lost. No one knew where I was. It was just me, surrounded by miles of forest, with no clear way out. I don't know how long I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness. But when the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a small surge of hope. I was still alive. I hadn't been swallowed by the forest. The sun was weak, just barely peeking through the branches, but it was enough to give me the strength to get up and keep moving. I forced myself to take deep breaths, to steady my shaking hands, and to push forward. I knew that panicking would only make things worse. The trail, or what had once been a trail, seemed more elusive than ever. Every step felt like I was going deeper into the unknown. I had to make a choice. Keep going or sit down and wait for someone to find me. But sitting there wasn't an option. I had to keep going. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing, and beyond that, light. Real, golden sunlight pouring through the trees. Couldn't believe it. I ran, stumbling, tripping over roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I pushed through, my heart racing, and when I finally broke through the dense woods, I saw the road. A small, dirt road, the kind you only find in the middle of nowhere. It was real, and it was the thing I needed to see. I dropped to my knees, exhausted and overwhelmed. I had found my way out. I wasn't lost anymore, and even though I had no idea how far I was from the nearest town, I knew I would make it. Someone would come by eventually. I wasn't alone. I wasn't lost forever. It was hours before a car came down that road, and I waved my arms frantically. The driver stopped, and I could barely form the words to explain what had happened. I was still in shock, still processing the fact that I had made it out. The driver offered me a ride, and I didn't hesitate. I climbed into the car, my body shaking from exhaustion, and the car started moving down the road, back to civilization. The relief I felt when I finally made it home was overwhelming. It was like I had been holding my breath the entire time, and now I could finally exhale. I was safe. I had been lost, yes, but I had found my way back. And as I sat there, staring out the window, I realized something. The forest wasn't just a place to get lost in. It was also a place to find yourself again. Started as a day hike, something I'd done dozens of times before. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the trees seem to close in around you, muffling the sounds of the outside world. That Saturday morning, I decided to explore a trail I'd heard about but never tried. It was supposed to lead to a secluded lake deep in the forest, untouched by crowds. Armed with a map I printed off the internet, a half-full water bottle, and a granola bar, I felt ready for an adventure. The first few miles were exactly what I had hoped for. Peaceful and quiet, with only the rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of birds keeping me company. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through tall pines and oaks, their branches forming a canopy overhead. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of sunlight streaming through the gaps, dappling the ground in golden patches. The air smelled earthy and clean, a mix of damp soil and pine needles. I walked for what felt like hours, stopping occasionally to take in the beauty around me. At one point, I came across a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed in every color imaginable. Felt like stepping into a postcard. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be there, away from the noise and rush of daily life. But as the trail began to climb steeper and the trees grew denser, I noticed something strange. The path, once so clear, started to fade. The markers that had been nailed to trees every few hundred feet were suddenly nowhere to be seen. I paused, pulling out the map to check my bearings. According to it, the trail should have continued straight, but all I saw ahead was a tangle of undergrowth. I figured I must have missed a turn, so I backtracked a bit, scanning the trees for a marker. Nothing. Frustrated but not yet worried, I decided to push forward, hoping to pick up the trail again further ahead. The deeper I went, the less familiar everything looked. The trees seemed closer together now, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen leaves that made every step feel precarious. After another hour of aimless wandering, I realized I was lost. The trail was gone, and so was my sense of direction. Panic started to creep in, a slow, insidious thing that tightened my chest and quickened my breath. I forced myself to stop and think. "Stay calm," I muttered under my breath. "You've got a map. You'll figure this out." But the map was useless without any landmarks to orient myself. The trees all looked the same, an endless sea of green and brown stretching in every direction. I decided to climb a small hill nearby, hoping to get a better view of the area. The ascent was harder than it looked, the loose soil and rocks slipping under my boots. When I finally reached the top, I scanned the horizon, hoping to spot something recognizable. A break in the trees, a distant road, anything. But all I saw were more trees, stretching out to the horizon in every direction. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more oppressive. I knew I had to act fast. With no better option, I decided to follow the sun, reasoning that it would eventually lead me west, toward civilization. As I descended the hill, the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker with each passing minute. Walking became harder as the terrain grew rougher. The ground was littered with fallen branches and rocks hidden beneath layers of leaves. Every step felt like a gamble, and more than once, I stumbled, scraping my hands on the rough bark of nearby trees. My water bottle was almost empty, and my stomach growled in protest at the single granola bar I'd eaten hours ago. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I hadn't planned to be out after dark and was dressed in light hiking clothes, not nearly enough to keep warm. The sounds of the forest changed too, the cheerful chirping of birds replaced by the eerie calls of owls and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. Every noise seemed amplified in the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found a spot beneath a large tree where the ground was relatively flat and decided to stop for the night. Sitting with my back against the trunk, I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to conserve body heat. Sleep was out of the question. Every rustle and crackle in the dark sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I spent the night shivering and staring into the blackness, counting the hours until dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. Exhausted but determined, I set off again, sticking to a steady pace. My legs ached, and my throat was dry, but I pushed on, driven by the hope that I'd stumble across a road or a stream. By midday, that hope was beginning to fade. The forest seemed endless, and every direction felt like the wrong one. Then, I heard it, a faint, trickling sound that made my heart leap. Water. I followed the sound, stumbling through the underbrush until I came upon a narrow stream. Dropping to my knees, I drank greedily, not caring about the risk of bacteria or illness. The cold water was a lifesaver, refreshing me enough to think clearly again. I decided to follow the stream, reasoning that it would eventually lead to a larger body of water and, hopefully, signs of civilization. The going was slow, the uneven banks forcing me to climb over rocks and push through thick vegetation. But for the first time in what felt like days, I had a sense of direction. Hours later, just as the sun was beginning to set, I spotted something that stopped me in my tracks. A broken-down wooden bridge spanning the stream. It was old and rotted, but it was a sign of human presence. My heart raced as I crossed the bridge, ignoring the way it creaked ominously under my weight. On the other side, I found a narrow dirt path, overgrown but unmistakably man-made. I followed the path with renewed energy, my exhaustion forgotten in the rush of hope. It twisted and turned through the forest, and just when I began to fear it would lead nowhere, I saw it. A small cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney, and the faint glow of a lantern shone through the window. Stumbling up to the door, I knocked weakly, barely able to stand. The door opened, and a man stepped out, his face a mix of surprise and concern. I didn't have the energy to explain much, just muttered something about being lost. He helped me inside, offering me water and a blanket as I collapsed into a chair. It turned out I'd wandered miles off the trail, deeper into the forest than I ever should have gone alone. The man, a local hunter, said he'd been staying in the cabin for a few days and was about to head back to town. He gave me a ride the next morning, and as we bumped along the dirt road in his truck, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I'd made it out. The forest had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but I'd survived. And as much as I'd always loved the woods, I knew I'd never take their dangers lightly again. I've always thought of myself as an outdoorsy person. Growing up in Vermont, I spent a lot of time hiking through forests and learning to read maps. That's why, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep in the woods, I didn't hesitate to say yes. But by the end of it, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about nature, survival, and myself. We started the trip on a Friday afternoon. The plan was simple: hike about 10 miles to a remote campsite, set up camp, and enjoy the solitude of the forest. There were 5 of us: me, Alex, Sarah, Josh, and Megan. We were all reasonably fit and experienced hikers, though none of us were survival experts. We carried enough food, water, and gear to last 3 days, and I had my trusty map and compass tucked into the front pocket of my backpack. The first day went off without a hitch. The trail was well marked, the weather was perfect, and we made it to the campsite with plenty of daylight left. We pitched our tents in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees, cooked dinner over a portable stove, and spent the evening swapping stories around the campfire. It felt good to be away from the noise of daily life, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of the forest. The trouble started the next morning. After breakfast, we decided to go on a short hike to explore the area. I'd found an old trail marked on my map that looped around a small lake a few miles from our campsite. It wasn't an official trail, just a faint path used by hunters and adventurous hikers, but it looked manageable. We packed some snacks and water, left most of our gear at the campsite, and set off around mid-morning. The trail was faint but visible, winding through dense undergrowth and around clusters of moss-covered boulders. We had to duck under low-hanging branches and step carefully over roots that snaked across the ground like veins. It was slower going than we'd expected, but the scenery was stunning. The forest here was untouched, the kind of place where you could almost forget the modern world existed. About an hour in, we reached the lake. It was small but beautiful, with clear water that reflected the sky like a mirror. We took a break to admire the view, snapping pictures and tossing stones into the water. I checked my map and estimated that we were about halfway through the loop. If we kept moving, we'd be back at the campsite in time for lunch. But as we started walking again, the trail became harder to follow. It was overgrown in places and fallen branches blocked the path. We had to rely on my map and compass more than the trail itself. At one point, the path split into two, and we debated which way to go. I chose the left fork, thinking it would lead us back toward the campsite. I was wrong. The trail grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely. We were left standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees that all looked the same. I checked the map again, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. My compass still pointed north, but the dense forest made it impossible to get a clear sense of direction. Sarah suggested we backtrack, but by then we'd already walked so far that I wasn't sure we could find our way back to the fork. We decided to keep moving forward, hoping to intersect another trail or find a landmark that matched the map. But the deeper we went, the more disoriented we became. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing tighter together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, and the cheerful sounds of birds and insects faded into an eerie silence. Hours passed, and our initial confidence gave way to frustration and anxiety. We stopped frequently to check the map, but it felt useless now. The forest didn't match anything on paper. My compass still pointed north, but north didn't seem to lead anywhere. By late afternoon, we realized we were well and truly lost. Panic started to set in. Sarah and Megan were arguing about which direction to go. Josh was pacing in circles, muttering to himself. Alex kept insisting we should have turned back hours ago. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I'd always prided myself on my sense of direction, but now I felt like a fraud. How had I let this happen? We decided to stop and regroup. There was no point in wandering aimlessly and wasting energy. We still had some snacks and water, though not enough to last more than a day. I suggested we stay put and try to retrace our steps in the morning when we were less tired. No one argued, but the tension was palpable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. We hadn't brought any of our camping gear, so we had no tents or sleeping bags. We gathered some dry leaves and branches to build a makeshift shelter and huddled together for warmth. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes you feel like you're floating in a void. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't shut off. What if we couldn't find our way back? What if no one found us? The next morning, we woke up cold, stiff, and hungry. We shared the last of our snacks and set off again, trying to retrace our steps. But the forest was like a maze, and every direction looked the same. The tall trees obscured the horizon, and the thick undergrowth made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. By midday, we were more lost than ever. Our water was running low, and the stress of the situation was taking its toll. Sarah twisted her ankle stepping on an uneven rock, slowing us down even more. Megan started crying, her voice echoing through the silent forest. Josh tried to comfort her, but his own fear was evident. Alex was quiet, his face pale and drawn. I felt the weight of their trust pressing down on me, even though I didn't know what to do. Around mid-afternoon, we stumbled upon a small stream. The sight of running water lifted our spirits slightly. We refilled our bottles and rested for a while, trying to regain some energy. I studied the map again, looking for any clue that might help us. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or settlements, so I suggested we follow it downstream. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. We followed the stream for hours, its gentle babbling the only sound in the oppressive silence. The forest seemed less dense here, and I dared to hope we were getting closer to civilization. But as the sun set, we still hadn't found any sign of a trail or human presence. We spent another cold, uncomfortable night in the woods, our spirits sinking lower with each passing hour. By the third day, we were desperate. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs, and every step felt like a monumental effort. We'd been rationing our water, but it wasn't enough to keep us hydrated. Sarah's ankle had swollen, making it painful for her to walk. Megan's tears had dried up, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. Even Alex, usually the most optimistic of us, seemed on the verge of giving up. Then, around midday, we heard it, the distant roar of a waterfall. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It was the first sign of something, anything that might lead us out of this nightmare. We followed the sound, our pace quickening despite our exhaustion. The waterfall was smaller than I'd expected, more of a steep cascade than a dramatic drop. But it was a landmark and it gave us hope. I scanned the area, looking for signs of a trail or human activity. And then I saw it, a faint path leading away from the water. It was overgrown and barely visible, but it was there. We followed the path, our hearts pounding with anticipation. After about an hour, we emerged from the forest onto a gravel road. I almost cried with relief. The road wasn't marked on my map, but it had to lead somewhere. We turned right and kept walking, too tired to do anything but put one foot in front of the other. Eventually, we came across a small cabin. It looked abandoned, with its windows boarded up and the roof partially caved in, but it was shelter. We rested there for a while, using what little energy we had left to search for anything useful. Inside, we found an old, rusted tin of biscuits and a half-empty bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. Later that day, we heard the distant rumble of an engine. We rushed outside and flagged down a pickup truck driven by a local hunter. He looked as shocked to see us as we were relieved to see him. After listening to our story, he offered to drive us to the nearest town. We climbed into the truck, our ordeal finally over. Looking back, I'm not sure how we made it through those 3 days. The forest tested us in ways I never thought possible, stripping away our confidence and leaving us raw and vulnerable. But it also taught me something important. Survival isn't about knowing all the answers or having all the skills. It's about refusing to give up, even when every instinct tells you to. And sometimes, it's about finding hope in the smallest things. A stream, a sound, a faint path, and letting them guide you back to safety. Started as a day like any other, one I had planned for weeks. The weather was crisp, with a sky clear enough to promise a pleasant day of hiking. I had picked a trail in the national park, one I had read about online. The description said it was challenging but worth it for the scenic views and the peace it offered. I needed that peace. Life had been overwhelming lately. Work deadlines, personal issues, the usual chaos. And this hike was supposed to be a way to reset. I packed light but smart: water, snacks, a small first aid kit, my phone, a map, and a compass, though I wasn't worried about getting lost. The trail was marked, and I considered myself an experienced hiker. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour, winding through narrow, tree-lined roads that made me feel like I was already in the wilderness. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, just how I liked it. I laced up my boots, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and started walking. The first stretch of the trail was easy, a wide dirt path bordered by tall pines and the occasional wildflower. The air smelled of earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots and the distant chirping of birds. About an hour in, the trail began to climb. The incline wasn't too steep, but it was enough to make my legs burn. I welcomed the challenge, though, focusing on the rhythm of my steps and the steady thump of my heartbeat. The trees here were denser, their branches forming a canopy that dappled the ground with patches of sunlight. I paused occasionally to drink water and admire the scenery. A stream ran parallel to the trail for a while, its gentle gurgling adding to the sense of serenity. The first sign of trouble came when I missed a trail marker. I had been walking for about 2 hours and was feeling good, almost too confident. The path ahead forked, and instead of consulting my map, I chose the right fork, assuming it would loop back around. It wasn't until another half hour had passed that I realized something was off. The trail was narrower here, overgrown in places, and the terrain was rougher than I had expected. Still, I convinced myself I was fine. I had the map, the compass, and my phone. I wasn't lost, not really. Another hour passed, and my unease grew. The trail had disappeared entirely, replaced by a barely discernible animal path that twisted through the trees. I stopped to check my map and compass, but the dense forest made it hard to orient myself. My phone, which I had assumed would be my safety net, had no signal. I told myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I decided to backtrack, to retrace my steps to the fork where I had made my mistake. But as I turned around, everything looked different. The trees, the rocks, even the light. It was all unfamiliar. By late afternoon, I was officially lost. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel even more disorienting. I kept moving, hoping to stumble upon a recognizable landmark or a clearer path. But the more I walked, the more hopeless it seemed. The forest was vast, and I was just one small, insignificant person wandering through it. As the sun began to set, I knew I had to stop. Hiking in the dark would be dangerous, and I needed to conserve my energy. I found a relatively flat patch of ground beneath a large tree and decided it would be my campsite for the night. I hadn't planned for an overnight stay, so I had no tent or sleeping bag, but I did have a lightweight emergency blanket. I wrapped it around myself and tried to settle in. The ground was hard and cold, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. The forest, so peaceful during the day, felt menacing now. I barely slept, dozing off for minutes at a time only to jerk awake at some imagined sound. When dawn finally came, I felt both relief and dread. My body was stiff and sore, and my water supply was running low. I ate one of my granola bars, trying to ration my food, and set off again. My plan was simple: keep moving downhill. I knew streams and rivers tended to flow downhill, and finding water could lead me to civilization. The problem was the terrain. The forest floor was a maze of roots, rocks, and undergrowth, and every step required careful navigation. I slipped several times, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. By midday, I found a small stream. It was shallow and barely flowing, but it was water. I filled my bottle and used my water purification tablets, grateful for a small victory. I followed the stream for hours, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water or a road, but it twisted and turned through the forest with no end in sight. The second night was worse than the first. My body ached, my stomach growled, and the cold seeped into my bones. I tried to build a small fire using some dry twigs and my lighter, but it fizzled out almost immediately. I wrapped myself in the emergency blanket again, shivering and trying not to think about how dire my situation had become. By the third day, I was running on empty. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was foggy. I started to question my decisions, wondering if I had made a fatal mistake by leaving the initial trail. Every sound in the forest felt amplified, from the chirping of birds to the rustling of leaves. I knew I needed to stay focused, but it was hard. My phone's battery was almost dead, and I kept it off except for brief moments when I checked for a signal. Still nothing. Finally, on the afternoon of the third day, I saw something that made my heart leap. A clearing in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my legs trembling with exhaustion. When I broke through the tree line, I found myself standing in a meadow. At first, I thought it was another dead end, but then I noticed a faint trail cutting through the grass. It wasn't much, but it was something. I followed it, my pace quickening despite my fatigue. The trail led to a dirt road. I nearly cried when I saw it, the sight of something man-made after days in the wilderness overwhelming me with relief. I sat down on the edge of the road, catching my breath and trying to process what had just happened. Not long after, I heard the distant hum of an engine. I stood up and waved my arms frantically as a pickup truck came into view. The driver, an older man with a kind face, stopped and asked if I needed help. I explained as best I could, my voice cracking with emotion, and he offered to take me to the nearest town. As we drove, I looked out the window at the forest, its towering trees and endless shadows. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also unforgiving. I had made it out, but not without learning a hard lesson about respect for nature and the importance of preparation. When we reached the town, I called a friend to pick me up. Sitting in the small diner, sipping a cup of hot coffee, I felt a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. I was safe, but I knew I would never take the wilderness lightly again. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. I parked my car at the trailhead around 8 a.m., with the crisp morning air and sunlight streaming through the trees, giving me a false sense of comfort. The plan was straightforward: follow the marked trail to the ridge, have lunch, and head back before dusk. I had done similar hikes before, nothing too ambitious. This one was no different, or so I thought. The trail started off easy: soft dirt underfoot, the sound of birds overhead, and the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted past. I was carrying a small backpack with essentials: water, a granola bar, my phone, and a printed map, though I hardly looked at it since the trail was well marked. The incline grew steeper as I climbed higher, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. The higher I went, the quieter it became. The sound of distant traffic faded entirely, replaced by the steady crunch of my boots on the trail and the rhythmic sound of my breathing. The solitude was peaceful at first. By late morning, I reached the ridge. The view was breathtaking: rolling hills covered in dense forest stretching endlessly in all directions. I sat down on a flat rock, pulled out my water bottle, and took a long drink. Felt like I was on top of the world. But the moment of calm didn't last long. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, and I felt a strange unease. It wasn't anything tangible, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I shook it off, chalking it up to being alone in a remote area. I packed up and started heading back. That's when I made my first mistake. Instead of following the trail I came up on, I decided to take a different route down. I remembered seeing another trail marker a little farther along the ridge, and I figured it would loop back to the main trail eventually. It seemed logical at the time, but hindsight is a cruel teacher. The new path was narrower, overgrown in places, and less traveled. It wound steeply downhill, and I had to be careful not to lose my footing on loose rocks. The descent felt faster than the climb, and for a while I enjoyed the change of scenery. The forest here was denser, the air cooler, but as the minutes turned into an hour, doubt began to creep in. The trail wasn't looping back. Instead, it seemed to be leading me deeper into the forest. I stopped to check the map. That's when I realized my second mistake. The map didn't include this trail. It was just a vague outline of the main routes with no details of smaller, less maintained paths. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use GPS, but of course, there was no signal. Still, I told myself to stay calm. I could always retrace my steps back to the ridge, but retracing wasn't as easy as it sounded. The trail had been winding and uneven, and I quickly realized I hadn't paid enough attention to landmarks on my way down. I turned back, but everything looked different. Trees have a way of blending together, and without clear markers, I couldn't tell if I was on the same path or a new one. Panic started to set in, but I pushed it down. I knew the worst thing I could do was panic. I decided to keep moving, hoping to stumble upon a familiar section of the trail or, at the very least, find a stream or clearing to reorient myself. Hours passed. The sun, which had been high in the sky when I started, was now dipping lower, casting long shadows that made the forest feel darker and more oppressive. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. It dawned on me how utterly alone I was. As the light faded, I knew I needed to find shelter. Wandering aimlessly in the dark would only make things worse. I came across a cluster of large rocks that formed a sort of natural alcove. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the wind. I gathered dry leaves and branches to make a makeshift bed, then sat down to assess my situation. I had no signal, limited water, and no idea where I was. But I wasn't completely unprepared. I still had my granola bar, and my backpack contained a small flashlight and a whistle. I ate half the granola bar, trying to ration it, and blew the whistle 3 times, a universal distress signal. I listened, hoping for any sign of a response. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional creak of trees. The night was long and cold. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. I kept my flashlight off to conserve the batteries, but I held it tightly, ready to switch it on at the slightest hint of danger. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night alternating between bouts of restless waiting and blowing the whistle, though I began to lose hope anyone would hear it. When dawn finally broke, I felt a small surge of relief. The sunlight brought a semblance of safety, but it also revealed just how lost I was. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, an unbroken sea of green and brown. I decided to keep moving, sticking to a straight line as best as I could to avoid walking in circles. My priority was to find water. Without it, I wouldn't last long. By mid-morning, I heard the faint sound of running water. It was distant, but unmistakable. I followed the sound, scrambling over fallen logs and through thick underbrush until I found a small stream. Kneeling by the water, I drank greedily, ignoring the gritty taste of unfiltered water. I filled my empty bottle and took a moment to collect myself. The stream was a lifeline, but it was also a reminder of how far I was from civilization. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or even roads, so I decided to follow it downstream. The going was slow, the terrain was uneven, and the stream twisted and turned, forcing me to climb over rocks and push through dense vegetation. Still, it was a direction, and that gave me a glimmer of hope. The hours blurred together as I followed the stream. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, and my legs ached from the constant effort. I came across a few animal tracks in the mud, which made me nervous. I had no way to defend myself if I encountered a bear or a mountain lion. I tried to make noise as I walked, hoping to scare off any wildlife before it got too close. As the sun dipped low again, I started to lose hope. The stream hadn't led me to a road or a clearing, and I was exhausted. I found another sheltered spot to spend the night, this time beneath a fallen tree that formed a natural canopy. I repeated my routine of blowing the whistle and waiting, though deep down, I doubted anyone would hear it. The next morning, I woke up feeling weaker. My water supply was holding up, but hunger was taking its toll. I continued following the stream, though my pace was slower. Every step felt like a monumental effort. I began to notice small things I hadn't before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of birdsong. It was a strange mix of beauty and despair. By midday, I saw something that made my heart leap. A broken piece of fencing partially submerged in the stream. It was old and rusted, but it meant I was close to something, a farm, a road, maybe even a house. I pushed forward with renewed energy, scanning the forest for any signs of human presence. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a dirt road. The sight of tire tracks in the mud nearly brought me to tears. I followed the road, and after what felt like an eternity, I saw a small cabin in the distance. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the sight of it filled me with a mix of relief and disbelief. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle anyone. As I got closer, a man stepped out, his expression shifting from surprise to concern when he saw the state I was in. He didn't say anything. I didn't need him to. The sight of another human being of safety was enough to break the dam of fear and exhaustion I had been holding back. He led me inside, where I collapsed onto a chair. The warmth of the cabin, the smell of wood smoke, and the taste of the water he handed me were overwhelming. He didn't ask many questions, just gave me a blanket and let me rest. Later, he drove me to the nearest town, where I was able to call for help and let my family know I was safe. Looking back, I'm not sure what kept me going those 3 days in the woods. Maybe it was sheer stubbornness, or maybe it was the knowledge that giving up wasn't an option. Whatever it was, I learned a hard lesson about respect for nature and the importance of preparation. I haven't been on a hike since, but if I ever do go back into the wilderness, I'll be carrying more than just a granola bar and a map. Started as a day meant to clear my head. I had been overwhelmed by work, personal responsibilities, and the general chaos of life. The idea of venturing into the woods, a quiet place far removed from the noise of daily routines, seemed like the perfect solution. I had picked a trail that I'd found online, one advertised as secluded but scenic. It was supposed to be about an 8-mile loop through the forest, with plenty of small creeks, dense foliage, and a stunning overlook halfway through. I packed lightly: a water bottle, a protein bar, my phone, and a small first aid kit, just in case. My hiking boots, which had seen better days but were still reliable, felt snug as I laced them up. The weather forecast was clear, and I couldn't think of a better way to spend my Saturday. The trailhead was easy enough to find, tucked behind a small gravel parking lot that could hold maybe 5 cars. When I arrived, there were only 2 vehicles parked there, which I took as a good sign. The air was crisp and carried the faint smell of pine needles and damp earth. It felt good to breathe deeply, to let my shoulders relax. With my bag slung over my shoulder, I set off. The first couple of miles were exactly what I had hoped for. The path was well defined, cutting through a mix of towering oaks and maples, their leaves a vivid green in the midday light. Birds chirped sporadically, their songs echoing faintly in the otherwise quiet woods. Occasionally, I would pass a small creek, the water bubbling over rocks in a way that felt almost meditative. I stopped once to take a photo of a particularly picturesque spot where the sunlight streamed through the trees, illuminating a patch of moss-covered ground. It felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. About an hour in, I reached the overlook. The view was spectacular. Rolling hills stretching out endlessly, their green tops blending into a hazy blue horizon. I sat down on a flat rock and took a long drink from my water bottle. The silence was comforting, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stayed there longer than I had planned, soaking it all in, before finally deciding to continue. That's when things began to go wrong. The trail beyond the overlook was less distinct. The dirt path narrowed, and patches of grass and weeds encroached on the edges. At one point, I had to duck under a low-hanging branch, and the thought crossed my mind that the trail might not be as well maintained as I had assumed. Still, I pushed forward, confident that the loop would eventually bring me back to the starting point. About 30 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in quite some time. My confidence wavered. The path, if it could still be called that, had become faint, almost invisible in some places. Fallen leaves and twigs obscured the way, and I found myself second-guessing whether I was even on the trail anymore. I stopped and scanned my surroundings, trying to find any sign of a marker, a blaze painted on a tree, or even a worn patch of dirt that might indicate where others had walked. There was nothing. My phone was my first instinct. I pulled it out and opened the map app, but the screen showed no service. I tried switching to a downloaded offline map, but it was vague and unhelpful, showing only a green blob that represented the forest. Frustrated, I stuffed the phone back into my pocket and decided to backtrack. Surely I couldn't have strayed too far from the main trail, but retracing my steps proved harder than I expected. The woods looked different from this direction. Trees that had seemed distinctive before now blended into the endless sea of trunks and branches. I walked for what felt like an eternity, but I didn't recognize any landmarks. Panic began to creep in, a small knot in my stomach that tightened with every step. The sun, once high and warm, was now lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel denser. I paused to take another sip of water, rationing what was left in case it took longer than expected to find my way back. I hadn't brought nearly enough for an extended hike, and the protein bar in my bag suddenly seemed pitifully inadequate. As the hours dragged on, I came to a chilling realization. I was lost. The weight of that truth settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd read enough about hiking safety to know the basics. Stay put, they said. Someone will find you. But the thought of sitting still, alone in the growing darkness, was unbearable. Surely, if I kept moving, I'd find the trail again. I convinced myself that it was just a matter of perseverance. I kept walking. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was cloaked in shadows. The temperature dropped, and I regretted not bringing a jacket. I hadn't anticipated being out this late. The sounds of the woods changed, too. The cheerful bird songs were replaced by the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. My imagination turned these noises into threats. A bear, a mountain lion, something watching me from the shadows. I knew these fears were irrational, but they were hard to shake. Night fell completely, and the darkness was absolute. The thin beam of my phone's flashlight was my only source of light, and it barely illuminated the ground in front of me. Every step felt precarious, as if I might trip on an unseen route or stumble into a hole. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my stomach growled in protest. Still, I pressed on. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I found a relatively flat spot under a tree and sat down, leaning against the trunk. The ground was cold and hard, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. I wrapped my arms around my knees and tried to think. The rational part of my brain knew that I needed to conserve energy, to rest until morning light made it safer to move. But the fear of being alone, of being truly lost, kept me awake. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the cold and the unsettling noises of the forest. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but when I shone my light in the direction of the sound, there was nothing there. My heart raced, and I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything else. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and discomfort. When dawn finally broke, the relief was overwhelming. The forest, though still unfamiliar, felt less threatening in the light. I forced myself to eat half of the protein bar and took another small sip of water. Then I started walking again, this time paying closer attention to my surroundings. I looked for anything that might indicate human activity. A trail marker, a broken branch, even litter. But the woods remained unyielding in their sameness. Hours turned into another day. I rationed what little food and water I had left, my body growing weaker with each passing hour. The hope of finding the trail again faded, replaced by a grim determination to keep moving. I thought about my family, my friends, the people who would eventually realize I was missing. I clung to the belief that someone would come looking for me, that I just had to hold on long enough to be found. On the third day, as I stumbled through the forest, my legs threatening to give out, I saw it. a break in the trees that revealed a dirt road. The sight of it was almost too much to process. Tears blurred my vision as I forced my body to move faster, stumbling out of the woods and onto the road. It was empty, but it was a sign of civilization, of safety. I collapsed onto the ground, too exhausted to move any further. It was a couple of hours before a car came by. The driver, an older man in a pickup truck, stopped immediately when he saw me. He gave me water, called for help, and stayed with me until an ambulance arrived. As I sat in the back of the truck, wrapped in a blanket and sipping water, the reality of what I had been through began to sink in. I had made it out. I was alive. The experience stayed with me long after I returned home. I'd never felt so vulnerable, so exposed to the raw power of nature. It was a humbling reminder of how easily things can go wrong, how quickly control can slip through your fingers. But it also taught me something about resilience, about the strength it takes to keep going even when the odds seem insurmountable. I haven't been back to the woods since. Maybe one day I will, but not without better preparation. For now, I'm content to stay on solid ground, grateful for the life that I almost lost and the lessons I'll never forget. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains when I realized I had made a mistake. It wasn't the first time I had wandered off a marked trail, but it was the first time I couldn't find my way back. I'd planned the hike as a simple day trip, a chance to clear my head and disconnect from the endless buzz of work emails and city noise. I parked at a small, barely maintained trailhead in a national forest that I'd read about online, figuring it would offer solitude without being too remote. I packed light, a bottle of water, some granola bars, and my phone for photos and GPS. That phone, of course, was now nearly dead. The trail had been well worn at first, leading me through a lush, pine-scented forest. But somewhere along the way, I'd gotten curious about a side path. It was narrower, almost hidden by undergrowth, but it looked like it might lead to a higher vantage point. I told myself I'd only follow it for a few minutes. That was hours ago. At first, I wasn't too worried. I'm not an experienced hiker, but I'm not clueless either. I had a general sense of the direction I'd come from, and the terrain didn't seem that challenging. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out most of the fading light. The ground was a chaotic mix of roots, rocks, and soft patches of moss that made it hard to keep a steady pace. And then there was the unsettling silence. The usual forest sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, even the occasional snap of a twig, had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my own footsteps sound unnaturally loud. I stopped to catch my breath and check my phone. The battery icon was flashing red, and the GPS app was struggling to load. I cursed myself for not bringing a paper map or a portable charger. The signal had been spotty all day, and now it was practically non-existent. I tried to remember the advice I'd read about getting lost in the woods. Stay calm, retrace your steps, and don't wander aimlessly. Easier said than done when every direction looked the same. I decided to backtrack, but the path I'd been following seemed to have vanished. Maybe it had been an animal trail, not a human one. I'd heard that could happen in forests like this, where the wilderness reclaims everything so quickly. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to push it down, to find my way out. People got lost in the woods all the time, and most of them were found within a day or two. I just needed to keep moving and stay alert. As the light faded, so did my confidence. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the temperature dropped. I hadn't brought a jacket, assuming I'd be back before nightfall. Now I was shivering in my thin t-shirt, the sweat from earlier cooling uncomfortably on my skin. I tried to focus on practical steps. Find a clearing, stay visible, conserve energy. But my mind kept spiraling into worst-case scenarios. What if I twisted an ankle? What if I wandered too far and no one could find me? What if I stopped myself, thinking like that wouldn't help? I stumbled across a small creek and decided to follow it. Water sources often lead to civilization, right? At least that's what I'd heard. The creek was barely more than a trickle, winding its way through the underbrush, but it gave me a sense of direction. I kept walking, hoping it would lead to a larger stream or a road. The terrain grew more challenging, with steep slopes and thick brambles that snagged my clothes and scratched my arms. My legs were aching, and my feet felt like they were blistering inside my cheap hiking shoes. Still, I pressed on, driven by the hope that every step might bring me closer to safety. When darkness finally fell, it was complete. I hadn't realized just how much I'd been relying on the dim light to guide me until it was gone. The forest became a different place at night, unfamiliar and menacing. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl, made my heart race. I found a relatively flat spot near the creek and decided to stop for the night. Walking blindly in the dark seemed like a recipe for disaster. I sat down on the damp ground and tried to make myself comfortable. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing but the clothes on my back and the dwindling contents of my backpack. I ate one of the granola bars, washing it down with a few sips of water. I'd been rationing it all day, but now I was acutely aware of how little I had left. The night stretched on endlessly. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear some noise that jolted me awake. My body ached, my stomach growled, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. By the time the first hints of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt more exhausted than I'd been the night before. With the morning light came a renewed sense of purpose. I had to keep moving. Sitting around wouldn't help anyone find me, and it certainly wouldn't get me out of here. I followed the creek again, ignoring the protests of my sore muscles and blistered feet. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of trees and undergrowth. I tried to keep track of landmarks, a particularly twisted tree, a patch of bright red berries, but everything started to blur together. My stomach was gnawing at itself, and the water bottle felt unbearably light in my hand. By midday, the creek led me to a marshy area that slowed my progress to a crawl. The ground was soft and treacherous, sucking at my shoes with every step. Mosquitoes swarmed around me, buzzing in my ears and biting any exposed skin. I wanted to scream, to cry, to give up, but I forced myself to keep going. One foot in front of the other. That was all I could do. The turning point came when I stumbled across an old, overgrown logging road. At first, I wasn't sure it was even a road. It looked more like a gap in the trees. But as I followed it, the ground became more even, and I spotted faint tire tracks beneath the weeds. My heart leapt. Roads meant people. People meant help. I quickened my pace, ignoring the burning in my legs and the sharp pain in my side. The road wound through the forest, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches or patches of grass, but I kept following it. Hours passed, and I began to doubt myself. What if this road was abandoned? What if it led deeper into the wilderness instead of out of it? But just as despair was setting in, I heard something, the distant hum of an engine. I practically ran toward the sound, my body screaming in protest. The road curved, and suddenly I saw it. A small pickup truck parked on the side, its driver leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette. I waved my arms and shouted, my voice hoarse from dehydration and exhaustion. The driver looked up, startled, then hurried over to meet me. I collapsed as soon as I reached him, the relief washing over me like a wave. He helped me into the truck and handed me a bottle of water, which I drank greedily. He said something about how lucky I was to have found the road, how he'd only been there to check on a nearby cabin. I barely heard him, All I could think about was that I was safe. Later, after a hot meal and a long shower, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily things could have gone differently. A wrong turn, a missed road, and I might still be out there, wandering through the endless trees. The forest had seemed so peaceful and inviting at first, but it had shown me just how indifferent nature could be. I knew I'd never look at it the same way again. I've always loved hiking. Growing up in Vermont, I spent countless weekends wandering through the woods, my boots crunching over leaves and twigs. When I moved to Switzerland, the landscapes were different but just as inviting. The mountains here are something else, vast and towering, with forests that seem to go on forever. It was one of those sunny autumn mornings when I decided to explore a new trail I'd read about. A loop that promised stunning views and a good workout. Little did I know, that decision would lead to one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. I parked my car at the trailhead around 8 a.m. The air was crisp, and the sky was a clear, endless blue. I'd packed light, a water bottle, some snacks, my phone, and a map I'd printed out. The trail was supposed to be well marked, and I wasn't planning on being out there for more than a few hours. I'd read that the loop was about 10 kilometers, manageable for someone like me who's relatively fit. The first part of the hike was idyllic. The trail wound through a dense forest of pine and fir trees, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, springy layer. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled shadows that danced as the wind moved the trees. Birds chirped overhead, and every so often, I'd catch the rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It was peaceful, almost meditative, and I felt a deep sense of contentment as I walked. About 2 hours in, I reached a clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. Snow-capped peaks rose in the distance, their jagged edges cutting into the sky. I sat down on a large rock, pulled out a granola bar, and took a moment to soak it all in. It felt good to be out here, away from the noise and stress of daily life. After a while, I checked my map to confirm the trail's direction. According to the map, the loop continued through the forest on the other side of the clearing. That's where things started to go wrong. The trail on the other side wasn't as well-trodden as the one I'd been on. The dirt path was narrower, with more roots and rocks jutting out, and it seemed less maintained overall. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I'd made a mistake, but the map clearly showed the loop continuing this way, so I pressed on. The deeper I went, the less defined the trail became. It twisted and turned, and I found myself stopping frequently to make sure I was still on the right path. At one point, I noticed a series of small cairns, stacked rocks, that seemed to mark the trail, so I followed them. But after about 20 minutes, the cairns disappeared, and the trail seemed to dissolve into the forest. I pulled out my map again, trying to make sense of where I was. The dense trees made it hard to orient myself, and without any clear landmarks, the map was more confusing than helpful. My phone's GPS wasn't much use either. The signal was spotty, and the app kept freezing. I told myself to stay calm. I'd been hiking for years, and I knew the basics of wilderness navigation. If worst came to worst, I could always retrace my steps. I decided to backtrack to the clearing, but after walking for what felt like ages, I realized I wasn't finding anything familiar. The trees all looked the same, and there were no distinguishing features to guide me. My breathing grew heavier as a knot of anxiety formed in my chest. I stopped and tried to collect myself. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think clearly. The sun was still high in the sky, so I knew I had several hours of daylight left. I decided to keep moving, hoping I'd stumble upon either the clearing or some sign of the trail. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every direction looked the same, and I started to feel like I was walking in circles. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, I was truly scared. I hadn't seen another person all day, and the realization that I was completely alone in this vast wilderness hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped to take stock of my situation. My water bottle was half empty, and I had one granola bar left. I'd been hiking for hours and was starting to feel the strain in my legs. My stomach growled, but I forced myself to conserve my food. As darkness crept over the forest, I knew I had to find a place to spend the night. Wandering around in the dark would only make things worse. I looked for a spot that seemed relatively safe and sheltered. Eventually, I found a small clearing surrounded by dense shrubs. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I gathered some pine needles to create a makeshift bed and wrapped myself in my jacket to stay warm. The night was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Every sound made me jump, my imagination conjuring up all sorts of threats lurking in the shadows. I barely slept. The cold seeped into my bones, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. Would I find my way out tomorrow? What if I didn't? What if I ran out of food and water? What if... I tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, relentless and unforgiving. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I felt a wave of relief. I got up, stiff and sore, and forced myself to eat half of the granola bar. I needed the energy. My plan was simple: keep moving and try to find any sign of civilization. A road, a house, even another hiker, anything. I tried to keep track of my direction, using the sun as a guide, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. Hours passed, and my hope began to dwindle. Just when I was starting to despair, I heard something that made my heart leap, the faint sound of rushing water. I followed the sound, stumbling over roots and rocks, until I came to a small stream. It wasn't much, but it was something. I drank deeply, the cold water revitalizing me, and splashed some on my face. Streams often lead to larger bodies of water or to civilization, so I decided to follow it downstream. The stream twisted and turned, leading me through dense undergrowth and over slippery rocks. It was slow going, and I slipped and fell more than once, but I didn't care. I was moving with purpose now, and that gave me a renewed sense of determination. By late afternoon, the stream widened, and I spotted a dirt road running parallel to it. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled onto the road. I didn't know which direction to take, but I picked one and started walking. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small wooden sign pointing toward a village. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I finally reached the outskirts of the village, I nearly collapsed with relief. A kind older man saw me and offered help, giving me water and calling the local authorities. I explained what had happened, and they assured me I'd be fine. Looking back, I've never felt so small and vulnerable as I did during those 2 days in the forest. It's easy to take safety and comfort for granted, but being lost out there reminded me of how fragile we really are. I still love hiking, but I've learned to be more cautious. Now, I always carry extra supplies, a whistle, and a fully charged GPS device. The wilderness is beautiful, but it demands respect. I've always enjoyed hiking, especially in the fall when the air feels crisp and the leaves turn into bursts of red and orange. There's something about the quiet of the woods that makes me feel calm. A few months ago, I decided to take a solo trip to a national park I'd read about online. It wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 3-hour drive. The reviews mentioned that it had beautiful, less traveled trails, perfect for someone like me who prefers solitude. The morning I set out, I packed everything carefully. I had my backpack filled with water bottles, snacks, a map of the area, a compass, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a lightweight jacket. I even brought a small first aid kit just in case. I had my phone with me too, though I knew from my research that reception would be spotty at best. I figured I was prepared for anything. When I arrived at the park, it was exactly as the pictures had shown. Dense forests stretching as far as the eye could see, with trails weaving through them like veins. I parked my car at the lot near the entrance and checked the map again. There was a loop trail that caught my eye. It was about 8 miles long, and the description said it passed by a small, hidden waterfall. It sounded perfect. I'd get a good workout and see something beautiful. I started the hike around 9 a.m., figuring I'd be back at my car by early afternoon. The trail was well marked at first, with signs and colored blazes painted on the trees. The ground was a mix of packed dirt and scattered leaves, damp from the morning dew. The smell of earth and pine filled the air, and I could hear birds chirping in the distance. Felt peaceful. About 2 miles in, I reached a fork in the trail. One path continued along the loop, while the other was narrower and looked less traveled. According to the map, the narrower path would lead me to the waterfall. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to take it. I come here for the scenery, after all, and I didn't want to miss out. The narrower trail was a bit harder to follow. The blazes were farther apart, and in some places they were faded or missing altogether. Still, I pressed on, keeping an eye on the landmarks mentioned on the map. I crossed a small stream and climbed over a fallen log. After about an hour, I heard the faint sound of rushing water. Encouraged, I pushed forward, and soon, I found the waterfall. It wasn't massive, but it was beautiful. The water tumbled over a rocky ledge into a clear pool below. Sunlight filtered through the trees, making the water sparkle. I sat on a flat rock nearby, ate a granola bar, and drank some water. I felt accomplished. This was why I loved hiking, moments like this. After resting for a bit, I decided it was time to head back. I checked my map and retraced my steps. Or at least I thought I did. Somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The trail I was on didn't look familiar. The trees were denser here, and the ground was covered in thick moss. I stopped and pulled out my map, trying to make sense of where I was. I also checked my compass, but I couldn't tell if I was heading in the right direction. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I decided to backtrack to the last landmark I remembered, the fallen log. But when I tried to find it, I couldn't. Everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the underbrush. It all blurred together. I realized then that I was lost. I took a deep breath and sat down to think. I still had a few hours of daylight left, so I wasn't in immediate danger. I remembered reading somewhere that if you're lost, it's best to stay in one place and make yourself visible. But the stubborn part of me didn't want to give up yet. I figured if I kept moving, I'd eventually find the main trail again. As I walked, I marked my path by tying small pieces of tissue to branches. I'd seen it in a survival show and thought it might help if I needed to retrace my steps. The problem was, the terrain was uneven and full of obstacles. I had to climb over rocks, push through thick bushes, and navigate around fallen trees. Each step felt harder than the last. Hours passed, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The golden light turned dim, and the woods grew colder. I realized I needed to find a place to settle for the night. I found a spot near a large tree with a relatively clear area around it. I gathered some dry leaves and pine needles to create a makeshift bed and put on my jacket for warmth. I didn't have a sleeping bag, but I'd have to make do. The night was long and uncomfortable. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I knew most of the animals here weren't dangerous, but that didn't stop my imagination from running wild. I barely slept. When morning finally came, I felt groggy and stiff, but I was determined to keep going. I rationed my remaining water and snacks, knowing I'd need them to last. As I moved, I looked for any signs of the main trail, footprints, litter, anything, but the forest seemed untouched. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. My phone was useless without a signal, and I began to regret not telling anyone exactly where I was going. By the second night, I was exhausted and scared. My water was running low, and I'd only eaten a few handfuls of trail mix. I'd been walking in what I thought was the same direction, but I couldn't be sure. The forest seemed endless. On the third day, I stumbled upon a small stream. Relief washed over me as I knelt down to drink. I filled my empty water bottles and decided to follow the stream. Water often leads to civilization, I remembered reading. It was my best chance. The stream's path was rough, winding through rocks and thick vegetation. I slipped several times, scraping my hands and knees, but I kept going, driven by the hope that it would lead me somewhere. Hours later, I saw something that made my heart leap, a footprint. It wasn't mine. Someone else had been here. I followed the footprint's direction, scanning the ground for more signs. Eventually, I found an old fire pit, a circle of blackened stones with charred wood in the center. It wasn't fresh, but it meant people had been here before. Encouraged, I continued on, and soon, I heard a sound I hadn't expected, the hum of a motor. I climbed up a small hill and there it was, a dirt road. It wasn't much, but it was a sign of civilization. I followed it for what felt like miles until I saw a cabin. It looked weathered and empty, but it had a porch and an old satellite dish. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. Still, the sight of it gave me hope. I rested on the porch, and not long after, I heard the distant sound of a car. I ran to the road and waved my arms like a madman. The car slowed down, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a hunter, and when I told him I was lost, he offered me water and a ride to the nearest ranger station. When I finally made it back to my car, I felt a mix of relief and shame. I'd underestimated the woods and overestimated my preparedness. It was a hard lesson, but one I'll never forget. Now, whenever I hike, I make sure to stick to marked trails and always let someone know where I'm going. I've always enjoyed hiking, but I've never been what you'd call an expert. Most of the trails I've explored have been well-marked paths, the kind where you see a ranger's hut at the entrance and a map board with clearly labeled routes. That's why, when I decided to challenge myself with a more remote trail in the mountains, I thought I was ready. I brought water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a printed map I downloaded online. It was supposed to be a day hike, a step outside my comfort zone, but nothing too extreme. The idea of solitude appealed to me, the chance to escape the noise of everyday life. The trail started easy, a gentle slope weaving through tall pines. The air was cool, and the forest smelled of earth and pine needles. I followed the markers nailed to trees, orange squares that stood out against the green. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze were the only noises. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. I took my time, stopping to snap pictures of moss-covered rocks and little streams cutting through the undergrowth. The trouble started when I decided to take what I thought was a shortcut. I'd reached a fork in the trail where the map wasn't entirely clear. One path seemed to climb sharply uphill, while the other meandered into denser woods. The markers were harder to spot here, and I convinced myself that the uphill trail couldn't be right. It felt too steep for a route marked as moderate difficulty. So, I veered onto the other path, certain it would loop back to the main trail eventually. First, it seemed fine. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. I noticed fewer markers, but assumed they'd appear soon. After about 30 minutes, though, doubt began to creep in. The path wasn't as defined anymore, more like a deer trail than a hiking route. Branches clawed at my arms, and the trees grew so close together that the sunlight barely filtered through. I checked my map but couldn't pinpoint exactly where I was. I decided to backtrack, but that proved harder than expected. The way I'd come was no longer obvious. Trails in the forest can vanish if you're not paying attention, blending into the surrounding terrain. I tried retracing my steps but kept hitting dead ends or finding myself in unfamiliar spots. My heart began to race as I realized I was officially lost. I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I remembered reading that if you're lost, the best thing to do is stop moving and assess your situation. So, I sat on a fallen log, pulled out my water bottle, and tried to think logically. I still had daylight left, though the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. My phone had no signal, as expected in such a remote area. I decided to pick a direction and stick to it, reasoning that walking downhill would eventually lead to a stream or road. The forest grew thicker as I descended, the undergrowth turning into a tangle of ferns and thorny bushes. My legs started to ache from stepping over fallen branches and uneven ground. I checked my watch. An hour had passed, and I was no closer to finding my way out. As the sun began to set, the woods took on a different character. The cheerful birdsong faded, replaced by the occasional crack of a branch or rustle in the bushes. Every sound made me jump, my mind conjuring images of bears or mountain lions. I knew they were unlikely to attack a human, but the knowledge did little to calm my nerves. I needed to find a place to spend the night, as continuing in the dark would only increase my chances of injury. I found a relatively flat spot beneath a large tree and cleared away the leaves and twigs. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I had no tent or sleeping bag, just the clothes on my back and a lightweight jacket. The temperature dropped quickly after sundown, and I shivered as I huddled against the tree trunk. The forest was alive with noises I couldn't identify, each one amplifying my unease. Sleep was impossible. I kept my small flashlight off to conserve the battery, using it sparingly to check my surroundings. When morning finally came, I was stiff and exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I resumed my descent, hoping to stumble upon a stream. Water often leads to signs of civilization, or so I'd read. My water bottle was nearly empty, and I rationed the remaining sips carefully. Hunger gnawed at me, but I had only a handful of trail mix left. Hours passed, and my hope began to waver. I slipped on a mossy rock and scraped my knee, blood soaking through my pants. I tore a strip from my shirt to bandage it, cursing my decision to take that supposed shortcut. I hadn't seen any sign of a stream or human presence, just endless trees and more trees. By the third day, I was desperate. Dehydration had set in, my throat dry and my head pounding. I stumbled upon a muddy patch of ground with animal tracks leading to a small puddle. The water was murky, but I had no choice. I used my shirt to strain it as best I could before drinking. Tasted awful, but gave me the strength to keep moving. On the fourth day, I found an old logging road. It was overgrown, barely distinguishable from the forest floor, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead somewhere. My legs felt like lead, every step a monumental effort. I hadn't eaten in over a day, and my thoughts grew hazy. I wondered if anyone was looking for me, if I'd ever make it out. Finally, I heard the distant hum of an engine. The sound was faint but unmistakable. I stumbled toward it, tears streaming down my face. A truck appeared around a bend, and the driver's eyes widened when he saw me. He stopped, jumped out, and helped me into the cab. I was too weak to explain much, but he understood enough to know I needed help. He gave me water and a protein bar, and I devoured them like a starving animal. The driver took me to the nearest town, where I was treated for dehydration and exhaustion. The experience left me shaken, but it also taught me a hard lesson about preparation and respect for the wilderness. I still enjoy hiking, but I've never attempted anything that remote again. Now, I stick to marked trails, carry a GPS device, and always tell someone where I'm going. The forest is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. I'll never forget how close I came to being another cautionary tale.